Israel is quite unpredictable. I mean, for the last couple of years particularly, it's been acting in extremely irrational ways with a high level of paranoia and in a situation where you really can't tell what they're going to do. I don't think they know what they're going to do. They're kind of working themselves into a state in which they might kind of be trapped into trying to bomb Iran. They can't really do it without U.S. support. So the question is, will the United States authorize it? I mean, actually, technically, they probably could. They have missile-bearing submarines that they got from Germany in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, which are nuclear, so they're deeply submerged. And theoretically, they could attack Iran without crossing airspace. But almost every attack you can think of goes over somebody's airspace, and therefore they'd be pretty hard to do it without some kind of authorization, at least tacit. Turkey's not going to grant it. The question is whether the U.S. would grant it over Iraq, and then the next question is Saudi Arabia. But it's conceivable that they might try. I think it would be lunacy, but they might try. What about the U.S.? Well, you know, Obama who has very much escalated the Bush programs, is also sort of trapping himself into a situation, he and his advisors, in which they may not have a choice. They've significantly built up the threat against Iran. The main place is the island of Diego Garcia. It's an island, actually an African island, from which Britain expelled all the inhabitants, so the U.S. could build a major military base there, and it is one of the major military bases for bombing the Middle East and Central Asia. But Obama's escalated there. He sent hundreds of deep penetration ordnance, what are called bunker busters, which are plainly aimed at Iran. He sent facilities for supporting nuclear submarines with Tomahawk missile, nuclear-tipped missiles. All of this has been going on as a direct threat to Iran. And he's also been, the U.S. sanctions are becoming quite harsh, in fact, but it's quite striking that nobody's paying much attention to them outside of Europe. Europe and Japan, they kind of go along with, you know, they agree to be vassals to the United States. Not the rest of the world. I mean, the non-aligned countries, which is most of the countries of the world, have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium, but nobody pays any attention to them. They're the colonies, who cares? But it's getting a little harder to evade. Turkey, which is the major regional power, has just building new pipelines to Iran. It's increasing trade with Iran. They oppose the sanctions. Pakistan has just opened pipelines to Iran. But the big one that they are worried about is China. China just doesn't pay attention to U.S. orders. And if you feel that you own the world, that's pretty frightening. In fact, this government's getting desperate about it. Just a couple of weeks ago, the State Department issued warnings to China, saying that you've got to, if you want to be accepted into the civilized world, you have to meet your international responsibilities. Well, what are the international responsibilities? To follow U.S. orders, to obey U.S. sanctions. Those sanctions have no force whatsoever, except that we got the means of violence behind them. China's happy to obey the UN sanctions because they're toothless. The U.S. can't get serious sanctions through the UN. So China signs on to the UN sanctions, and they have no responsibility to follow U.S. sanctions. And they're probably laughing about it in the Chinese Foreign Office because the U.S. can't do anything about them. So they're continuing, as is Russia, their economic relations, developing gas fields and so on. In fact, China probably is in favor of the U.S. sanctions because it opens up the economic opportunities to them. They don't have to compete with European and U.S. firms. And the U.S. firms, European ones, are probably fuming about this because they would like to get it. But that's state policy. They're trying to It's also going on just strikingly in naval maneuvers. China has been protesting pretty loudly about the fact that the U.S. is carrying out major military naval maneuvers right off China's coast. In fact, they were very upset about the plans to send a nuclear-powered advanced aircraft carrier, the George Washington, to the Yellow Sea with, according to the Chinese, with capacity to strike Beijing with missiles. Well, here it's kind of brushed off, but we wouldn't react that way if China was carrying out maneuvers in the Caribbean. And in fact, the U.S. reaction is quite interesting, both the government and the press. China is being unreasonable. They're interfering with freedom of the seas, namely our freedom to carry out military maneuvers right off their coast. Of course, nobody else has that right, just us. And they're interfering potentially with our forward deployment off their coast. Nobody has that right off our coast. But these are all just reflections of a very deep-seated, deeply ingrained imperial ideology, which says, yeah, we own the place, this is our world, we own it. If anyone interferes with our right to do what we want, it's their fault. And when China doesn't accept it, that's why China is considered a threat. They do not follow orders, and they exercise their own sovereignty, and that's intolerable. So this is building up. And if you go back to Iran, it turns out to be the same thing. Just yesterday, for example, the Wall Street Journal announced that the U.S. is now stepping up its plans for a huge arms shipment to Saudi Arabia, helicopters, F-15 jets, and so on, carefully designed so that Israel gets the advanced stuff and Saudi Arabia gets the second-rate stuff, but nevertheless huge, biggest arms sale maybe ever. This is supposed to be in defense against Iran. Well, what exactly is the Iranian threat? It's interesting, it's always talked about. It's in fact considered by foreign policy analysts, the major, and the government, the major problem of world order. This is in fact called the year of Iran, because it's such a great problem. So what's the threat? Well, actually we have an authoritative answer to that. Unfortunately, the press won't cover it, but it's there. In every year, the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence give submissions to Congress analyzing the global security situation. They just did last April. Of course, there's a section on Iran, and what it says is quite interesting, hence unreportable. What they say is Iran has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region. So it's not very clear what Saudi Arabia needs helicopters and F-15s for. They have practically no capacity to deploy force abroad. Their military doctrine, they say, is purely defensive. It's designed to hold off an invasion of Iran long enough for diplomacy to be possible. That's their military posture. They say if they're developing a nuclear capability, which is not nuclear weapons, it would be part of the deterrent strategy. They need a deterrent, which is not surprising. The two countries on their border are occupied by a hostile superpower. Israel's got nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Yeah, they're in a kind of a dangerous spot. So this would be part of their deterrent strategy if they're doing it. What exactly is the threat then? Well, they go on and explain the threat. The threat is they're exercising their sovereignty. They're trying to extend their influence in the neighboring countries. So they're trying to extend their influence in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's intolerable because we own those countries. So when we invade them, that's fine. But if they try to influence them, that's what's called destabilizing. We impose stability. Standard terminology. In fact, it's so standard that an editor of Foreign Affairs once wrote that about the Allende coup, Pinochet coup, that unfortunately we had to destabilize Chile to establish stability. And he wasn't contradicting himself, because yes, we had to destabilize it in throwing out the government, imposing a dictatorship, and the result is stability because it follows orders. That's the view of the world, and that view you just, every newspaper article you read, every commentary you read in international affairs literature, it kind of just assumes this perspective. And it's a very natural perspective if you feel you own the world. And in fact, if you look at U.S. documents, internal documents, it goes way back. It goes back to the Second World War, when Roosevelt's advisors realized that the U.S. was going to come out of the war as a world dominant power, replacing Britain. And they established guidelines which are explicit and never discussed because they're too explicit. What they say is that the U.S. must control a vast area. At least, they said, the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, which includes the Middle East and the Far East, maybe more, but has to include at least this. And within that area, there can be no exercise of sovereignty that interferes with U.S. plans. The U.S. must have absolute power.
Hemos estado hablando aquí con el profesor Noam Chomsky. En el próximo segmento vamos